Today we have an interview with author Helen St. Clair, who, when she noticed a rise of violence against women in Western North Carolina, decided to see if stats could explain the story. Going as far back as 1808, she discovered a haunting trail of victims of femicide, which means the killing of a woman or girl, in particular by a man. St. Clair soon realized the information she was gathering was supposed to be a book. The Killing Trails, 2 Centuries of Violence Against Women in Western North Carolina, was published in December of 2025 on Amazon. Here's a synopsis. Between 1808 and 2025, more than 150 women and girls were murdered in the mountains of Western North Carolina. Some cases made headlines. Most did not. Their names filled brief newspaper columns, then faded from public memory. The Killing Trails is the first comprehensive record of these deaths, a county-by-county, case-by-case documentation of over 2 centuries of violence against women across 23 counties in one of America's most beautiful and deadly landscapes. From the Ballad of Naomi Wise to the serial killers who stalked the Blue Ridge Parkway, from domestic violence homicides in Asheville to cold cases still under investigation, this book names the victims, follows the investigations, and exposes the system failures that allowed killers to walk free. This is not a book about killers. It is a book about the women and girls they killed, and the many more killed by husbands, boyfriends, and neighbors whose names never made the news at all. The Killing Trails features cases that became murder ballads, such as Naomi Wise, Frankie Silver, and Tom Dooley's Laura Foster, the 1948 Highland Hospital fire that killed Zelda Fitzgerald and 8 other women, serial killers who hunted along I-40 and in the Pisgah National Forest, dozens of unsolved cold cases with active rewards, and women who went missing and whose bodies were never recovered. There is much to love about North and South Carolina, but the 2 states have also had their fair share of violent and senseless crimes over the years. From murders on the Blue Ridge Parkway, in the heart of big cities or sleepy college towns, and along the coastal waters, some of these stories may be new to you. Some may have happened in your town. Some may involve people that are still missing to this day. But all will leave you remembering to always be vigilant about the people you meet and the places you go. I'm Renee Robertson. Please join me for Missing in the Carolinas. Episode 166, an interview with Helen St. Clair, author of The Killing Trails, 2 Centuries of Documented Violence Against Women of Western North Carolina. Helen St. Clair is a legal researcher and writer based in Western North Carolina. The Killing Trails is her first book, documenting over 150 cases of femicide across 23 counties from 1808 to 2025. She moved to the region in 2002 and watched the rate of violence against women accelerate over 2 decades, from roughly 1 case per year in the 1980s to more than 6 per year since 2020. She is currently working on additional volumes covering the Piedmont and Eastern North Carolina as part of the Unrecorded Dead series. She holds a JD from the UNC School of Law. Welcome, Helen. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Renee. I'm very happy to be here.
I'm really excited to discuss your book with you. So let's go ahead and get started.
Okay.
In your author's note at the beginning of the book, you discuss 4 reasons why you wanted to focus on documenting cases of violence against women in Western North Carolina from 1808 to 2025. Could you share those reasons with us?
Sure. And originally, I didn't know how far back I could go in the research at first. So I'm just going to start from the beginning and tell you why this topic interests me so much. And then I'll tell you how it happened. I first moved to Western North Carolina in 2002. And back then, femicide was extremely rare. Even homicide was a lot more rare than it is now. When a woman was murdered, people talked about it, and it was all over the news, and the whole region would know about it. And over the years since I first moved here, I watched that gradually change. And by the 2010s, I think particularly 2012, I was reading about such murders constantly, not just in Western North Carolina, but all over the country and the world. Because, of course, we had access, we had the internet. That changed what we had access to and what we could find out about. But it seemed to me that femicide had become much more prevalent, and that since most of the killers are men, they seem to feel like they were entitled in some way. They seem to have become more emboldened in committing such murders so prevalently. I was in the fall of 2025. Well, actually, if we go back to May of 2025, in this region, we found out that a woman had been kept captive in Haywood County by the Eccleston. She's the Eccleston captive. We still don't know her name, which is good. And she had been kept for 4 months. She had rescued herself and escaped in May of 2025. I was very disturbed by that. And then in August of last year, I was very upset about the teenage girl who was murdered and found in the woods. Her name is Sundari Anders Hopkin. And then in September, there was a murder on I-26, Carly Johnson. And then by the time that Jennifer Rose Gerard was murdered in her home in Biltmore Village in November, as I said, I saw that this was just telling me something, and I wanted to research the problem. Um, Over the years, my children would hear me talk about them, and they would say, "Well, Mom, it's just worse now because of the internet, and we know all about it, and we hear about it a lot more." I just wasn't sure if they were right or not, and I wanted to find out. So after Jennifer's murder, and then the day after that, there was a woman whose boyfriend set her on fire when she didn't bring him a beer in Jackson County. I had had enough, and the lawyer in me, the woman in me, the mother in me, just wanted to start looking into the problem. I did not sit down to write a book. I sat down to study the problem myself and to compile data and information so that I could understand if my children were right or if I was right, my feeling was right. So I started compiling from all the sources I could find on the internet. And I created what I call the comprehensive study of violence against women in North Carolina, Western North Carolina. I limited it, of course, initially just to right here. And I found out that my children were wrong. I found out that in the 80s and 90s, there was roughly one femicide per year in all the counties, all 23 counties of Western North Carolina. And then in the 2000s and the 2010s, it jumps to roughly two a year. But since 2020, it is now over six a year. And in both 2024 and 2025, we have had 10 documented femicides, sometimes with children killed alongside their mothers. And it is not attributable to population growth because our population has only grown by about a third since 1990. And the rate at which women and girls have been killed has risen more than fivefold. So something else is clearly happening. And I considered Western North Carolina to be a microcosm of the world, actually, because what's happening here is definitely happening across the South and the country and the world. So I started here because I'm living here. This is my baseline. And everything I learn here, I can later apply to the other regions that I'm going to write about. So the book, as I compiled the data, it ended up with four purposes, as you said. I was so haunted by these women and their murders, and that I just wanted to remember them. I wanted to memorialize them, first of all. I wanted to put their names down in one place. Everybody could see, look, this is what happened over these years. And their stories had not been told fully. They still aren't. Some of them, there just isn't enough information out there. So that was the first purpose. And the second one was to document it in one place because I had not found where anyone had done that. Like, as you mentioned, the author of the Virginia Olsen case, her case, he wrote a book, and then we have the Nancy Morgan situations like that. But no one had told it all in one place, and no one had noticed that there was such an intense increase over a short period of time. So I want people to know that. People think of Asheville, and I did too when I moved here, as a wonderful, peaceful, small, tight community of happy people and a wonderful place to tour. And it is all those things. I moved here because people were happy here. I'm from the Flatlands and I loved it here. But I think I had no idea at the time that I had no knowledge that I have now as to how many women have been murdered here and where these things have happened. So they've happened, like I mentioned. What really prompted me in November to start writing was the number of cases right around me in Asheville These were places I go to all the time. I go to Biltmore Village, I go to Brugger's. We all know these places, and everyone drives on 26. That was what prompted it to find out if my children were right or wrong. The fourth reason, so helping people understand what places have been the site of violence and repeated violence, how you can protect yourself, how you can become safe here if you're going to visit or move here. And then finally, I wanted to show that this is not a static problem. It's not something from the past. It's accelerated as the interstate system came on board, as tourism increases, as system failures happen, the courts, the parole system, the bond system, and as apathy, which is another thing I'm seeing, is increasing. So I just wanted to wave a red flag and call attention to the problem and the increase. That was why.
We appreciate you doing that too, because when I was looking through the book, I know about a lot of these crimes by the nature of the podcast, and I've been in
We've
West
covered
Carolina.
several of them. Yeah.
Yeah. But even that, I still did not know the scope until I looked at how you had it all in one place. Even the more recent cases, what are those behind a paywall or something? Because I had not heard about them, like the Eccleston case that you were talking about.
Oh, wow. That
Yeah,
was
so
actually in the regular news. That was WLOS
yes,
started.
it didn't hit the Charlotte area
Yes,
where
it did not. Yeah.
and that happens sometimes.
Right.
So
Charlotte's a whole nother ball of wax to attack. Well, I'll tell you about that later, how I'm working on it.
yeah, I can imagine. Um,
Yeah,
so I want to skip to this one question because I think it kind of segues into it about how you discovered that certain locations in Western North Carolina appear to be crime clusters.
right.
What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's pretty clearly laid out in the book that Bent Creek and the Pisgah National Forest is one cluster area. That's a cluster area for different things, also for a lot of disappearances, not just of women, of course, but people who hike. There are other people and podcasters who cover those facts in detail. But here on paper, it's a recreation area for everyone. But in the data, so many women have been abducted from that region while jogging or discovered as skeletal remains off of service roads and picnic areas. So we have Karen Stiles was taken off the Hard Times Trail, and Judy Smith's remains were discovered near the Stony Fork picnic area. Irene Bryant and her husband were found off Yellow Gap Road. Harriet Simmons and Jamie Hurley were also recovered in Pisgah. And nearby, there's the case of the woman who worked at Pisgah Inn, whose body who's murdered there in 2018. That's not quite in the forest, but it's nearby. So, and then at Azalea Road in East Asheville, I found another cluster, even though it's just, I say just two cases, and I don't mean to diminish it, but exactly 10 years apart, two women, both in their early 20s, were found dead on Azalea Road. It was Pamela Murray in 1987 and Amber Lundgren, who you've covered, in 1997. And they were both seen in downtown Asheville before they were found dead on that road. We don't know if they were murdered there or just dumped there, but both cases are still unsolved, and they have that geographic connection, which was pointed out by I found it, but then I looked and someone a commentator on the Mountain Express had pointed it out in 2010. So the connection was not made from any official statement or from any investigators. The people had discovered it.
That's interesting.
It is to me. Those are the main clusters that I found. And then you have the French Broad River itself, which is, and so interstate, the forest trails, the interstate, and then the river itself. Many women's bodies have been dumped there and found there. So it kind of raises the specter of, do we have a repeat offender going to these places? Is it the same offender going to familiar ground? Or is it multiple predators recognizing a tactical advantage to this area? Remote access, few witnesses, and delayed discovery. And often some of these women remain missing for years or forever, as you well know.
Well, it's
Reporting.
such a dense area, not Azalea Road necessarily, but the French Broad River and Bent Creek, that's such a dense area.
Yeah.
Like People
exactly.
just disappear there hiking. So you can
Yeah,
see why a predator would kind of zoom in on it as a key location where they
you
could
absolutely can.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, there was one murderer who killed his girlfriend. He served time too, and then burned her body on the parkway. The burning was found. He was caught and he served time, but he maintains that he never did it. He's out of prison now, by the way. He only served, I think, 12 years or 15 years, if I'm not mistaken. I have to check. But again, that was just on the parkway itself. A lot of, yeah, it's a remote.
Also a lot of crime on the parkway.
There's
Like
a lot of,
talking about
and
that.
when we say crime versus femicide,
Yeah.
when I was just doing Western North Carolina, if I had just covered violence against women, the book would have been 1,000 pages long. I had to focus, I had to zero in on what was feasible to write about. And so I focused on murder, sometimes these ones who escaped, the ones who are still missing. And whenever someone was murdered alongside the woman, whether it was a man or a child, their names go in there and to be remembered also. I thought that was very important. I didn't want to make light of it.
Oh, I
Even
think
if it's a book about femicide.
I found one of the most intriguing cases that you discussed in the Killing Trails to be the story of Frances Frankie Silver from Burke County. I'd never heard of that story before. Could you
Yeah,
tell us a little bit about what happened to her in 1833?
absolutely. And I have to almost laugh because she is the outlier case because she's the convicted killer and
Right.
not the victim. And I almost excluded her. But I realized that underneath the story, which is kind of sensational, was a woman who lived with what we would call intimate partner violence, most likely. And she also had no legal way to speak for herself because at the time that she did or did not commit this murder, uh, criminal defendants in North Carolina had no right to testify on their own behalf, not just women, anyone. It astonished me to actually learn that. So I kept her in because of the silencing of her and because of the fact that we don't really know if she committed the murder, and she was definitely a victim of violence. So the story goes that in 1831, and Frankie was a mother, she killed her husband, Charlie, dismembered his body, which would be a lot to do for a woman, and burned his remains in their cabin. She was tried, convicted, and in 1833 became the first white woman, and I'll tell you why I say that, to be executed in North Carolina. I have to say that because enslaved Black women had certainly been executed before her, and the legal system treated them differently too. And that will become clear in my second book, which covers the Western Piedmont, because we have such killings there, which we don't have here. But at that time, as I said, criminal defendants couldn't testify in their own defense. So Frankie never got to tell a jury what happened, what life with Charlie was like, why she may have killed him if she did. Later accounts described him as being abusive. So she may have been acting in self defense or in defense of her child. But what is the most haunting thing about her case and kind of became the reason why, it was memorialized in a ballad, became legend, is how many times she was silenced. So she was silenced by what we think of as the violence in her marriage. She was silenced by the legal system that literally wouldn't let her speak, even in her own trial. And then on the gallows, the legend is that when the sheriff asked her if she had any final words, her father, Isaiah Stewart, shouted from the crowd, "Die with it in you, Frankie." And she did. So her own father silenced her. And we don't know what he didn't want her to say. Some people think, some historians think, that she was about to confess that her father and brother had helped kill her abusive husband and that he wanted to protect the brothers. Others think she just wanted to tell the truth about what Charlie had done to her. But either way, the question becomes, was a woman's life so expendable and was her voice and truth so valueless that the men around her deserved more protection than she did, even at the moment of her death? So we'll never know because she died with it in her. But her case is the ancestor of all the other modern cases where a woman's history of abuse doesn't make it into the courtroom record, or we never hear from her at all. Um, And I think that the same forces that killed Frankie, the isolation in these mountain communities, uh, people closing ranks, and then the system that doesn't really protect women are still operating in these mountains. And we see that later, about 160 years later, with Nancy Morgan in 1970, the domestic Peace Corps worker, whose murder remains officially unsolved, but unofficially we seem to know what happened now. And that's another astonishing case. But thank you for mentioning the Frankie Silver case. I love that case. I mean, I
Oh,
not
it's
for
horrifying. It's
but
horrifying, though.
it's it,
Wasn't she really young too when she was executed?
I think she was still a teenager.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So, talking about that, that's a good segue into our next question. You explore how in the 2000s, the pattern of killings against women shifted to what appeared to be more intimate partner homicides in homes. Four
Mhm.
Western Carolina counties appeared to have many of those victims: Buncombe, Henderson, Burke, and Haywood counties. Do you have any theories on why intimate partner violence in that part of the state has been on the rise in the last 20 years?
Well, I'll say first of all that Buncombe, Henderson, Burke, and Haywood probably have the biggest populations. Just to set that record straight of all the counties. So we're clearly going to see more of an increase in those counties. I'm gonna give you my theories, but I'll just give you the numbers first because I think they're important. So the North Carolina SBI reports show that intimate partner violence deaths have risen sharply. In 2022, there were 115. In 2023, there were 135. And in 2024, there were 155. And the data is not in for 2025 yet. It will come out in the spring, the final numbers. So, what I'm going to say is just my theories. These are not anything with certainty with it. The data tells us something is going on, but not exactly why. I think that it's increasing poverty, possibly the opioid crisis, the isolation of mountain communities where it's harder to get into shelters or legal help. And I also would attribute it to the collapse of mental health infrastructure in this state and also to better documentation compared to earlier decades. I don't have a single neat explanation, but I do see that it is an accelerating crisis layered on top of older patterns that we've had since Frankie. And I also would say the system is perhaps cavalier towards women who are in dangerous situations. Or if I'm wrong, then it's a system that doesn't act in time or with enough force to keep her alive. Because there are examples. We have Cindy Smith in Haywood County. This was in 2020. She did everything that advocates tell victims to do. She left an abusive ex, moved in with her family, had relatives checking on her, but he was quietly stalking her and learning her routines. And then he ambushed and killed her and her unborn daughter. She was pregnant. And there was no paper trail to trigger an intervention, but the danger was there. And I also don't think that we can ignore the cultural piece here. There is a rise of online communities that tell men that they're entitled to women's bodies and that rejection justifies their rage. I think we see an acceleration there starting in the 2010s that exploded in the 2020s. And you can't prove causation, but there is an ideology, a belief that I own her. And if I can't have her, no one can. This mentality that goes on. Um, but there is one other thing I'll mention in I can't remember the year exactly, but there's a case, Michaela Harrison. Her boyfriend was arrested on multiple assault on female and gun charges, but he bonded out and she was shot to death in her own apartment a few days after he got out. And I covered that case extensively in my book because her mother was warning. It ended up, I think, a sheriff's deputy was later shot while chasing him. But if we had just attended to the problem faster and sooner, taken seriously, I don't know how many assault on a female charges he had, something better could have resulted for her. So those are just my thoughts. I don't really have a clear theory as to why it's on the increase, but those are my thoughts. I don't know if you have any other ideas
I
about
think
it.
there's just some plausible theories. I'm just, I guess, shocked that we're still in this place. that
I agree.
in the
I
1950s and 60s, women couldn't call the police against their husbands. And I
right.
thought we had gotten past that, but it appears that there's still ways for perpetrators to work the system or slip through the system to where they can have this huge record and then make it to murder a woman and then
Why was Donald Stroop bonded out, who went on to kill Jennifer Rose Gerard? We'll get to that a little bit later. I wanted to
yeah,
talk about that. He had been, I can't remember, I think it was 9 times he had been to jail for, and again, he was a mental health issue too. He was another case that we don't have infrastructure for right now or anymore. There, but as you say, I thought the same way that in the 50s things were as you mentioned, but that in the 80s we seemed to have so much more freedom. Women seemed to be able, it wasn't until the 70s that women could even have a bank account in North Carolina. So we thought we had come so far, only to find after 2020, maybe even 2010, no, we're backwards. We're sliding backwards now. And that's what I wanted to call attention to with this book, is that why is this happening? I'm not a statistician, but somebody needs to look at this data and do something with it. And I just want to keep documenting it because I want to keep honoring the women. I don't want their names to be forgotten. I don't want the numbers to be overlooked. And if anything can be done to keep women safe, that's what I want. Um, I want women to educate themselves and learn how to recognize a predator if that's possible to do. You know, before the internet became so important in our lives and smartphones, people didn't really know if they had, for example, married a psychopath or a narcissist. We didn't have that terminology. In college, I studied abnormal psychology, but I didn't know what that looked like in reality. No one did. So, but there are ways that we can educate ourselves now and learn what gaslighting is and learn, red flags to protect ourselves. And we can also learn these cultural pieces and these locations that have been the site of repeated violence. Where are they? How can I avoid putting myself in danger? So, when the danger is within your own home, that is totally different. And we see that shift, as you mentioned, starting around 2010s and 2020s. We do. It's not as many stranger murders. It's more people we know.
well, I appreciate you calling attention to it and working so hard to sort of sound the alarm because I haven't seen anyone else do it. And, North Carolina is very near and dear to me. And I write about and talk about these things all the time, but even I was not aware of how serious it has gotten, like in
Thank you.
recent years. It's one thing to look back at the historical, events and murders, but to see it still happening and the increase of it was very alarming to me, to be honest.
It
I think
should
it would be
be.
alarming to our listeners too.
If I didn't have a day job, I would have finished my second book by now, possibly my third. I'll tell you about that in a little bit when we
Yeah.
get to that. Um, but I want to keep documenting it because no one's doing it. I want all this information in one place so that someone can reference it and use it later and do something with it. So, but I'm going to keep documenting it because I feel driven to do it. I was going to tell you a little bit about, well, my research process and how, because you
Yeah,
wanted
let's
to
talk
know.
about that. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
No,
preempt your
go right
question.
ahead.
But what happened, I did not set out to write this book when I was disturbed by the prevalence of violence that I was witnessing in the fall of 2025. I set out just to find out what was really going on. Is this really accelerating to such an extent? And so, like I said, I compiled a study. It was about 50 pages. And as I was reviewing it, I thought, this is supposed to be a book. And I never knew that I was going to write this book. I just felt compelled to. I said, this needs to be a book. Women need to know. Everyone needs to know what's going on here in this little haven, this little microcosm of the world. This is accelerated to this extent. So I want to be clear that I didn't scour every court file in Western North Carolina counties or all of appellate records. To me, my research is a floor, it's not a ceiling. And these are the women that I have documented are just the tip of what maybe really happened. Because as I researched, I found that 2001 was the only year that I couldn't find any documented femicides. And I thought statistically that sounds very unlikely. So the more likely explanation is that the deaths weren't captured in any of the sources that I found. So that's why I called the series The Unrecorded Dead. And of course, obviously, back in the day, in the more in the 19th century, there must be cases we don't know about. Maybe someday that will come to light, and they can be recorded. And I wanted to tell you also, occasionally I will run across a case from Western North Carolina that I missed. And whenever I do, I add that to the book and I republish it on Amazon. And eventually I'm going to be republishing them on Ingram Spark because I want it to be comprehensive. But how I did it was I just started listing out all the names I knew. And I went online and started searching systematically for newspaper archives, the North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence database, law enforcement cold case pages, and even Find a Grave. My legal background helped a lot because I was able to kind of read between the lines and see what questions weren't asked, what patterns weren't noticed, what connections were missed by investigators. And so I want especially my Western North Carolina book to be a living document that continuously records whatever else I can find. If I had more time, I would do more research, but I can only do so much and still keep a day job going.
I understand that. I was very fascinated by your chapter on how you think local media conglomerates in North Carolina may have contributed to the underreporting of many of these crimes against women. Could you explain more about that?
Definitely. I don't think the problem is just limited to underreporting. I think there is a lack of follow-up in journalism that should be there. And I also, I hate to say it, but I see a lack of interest in such follow-up. As you said, you weren't aware of the problem. I wasn't aware of it, so I started documenting it. Journalists are supposed to be the ones keeping us aware of it. And I don't think they're doing that. So from my research, I found that since about 2002, the United States has lost three-quarters of its local journalists. And in Asheville, you definitely feel that because whenever a woman is killed, there is a one short story that is built almost entirely from the police report or press release. And then it disappears from the news cycle. And I also think that the press, Asheville Citizen Times included, has been gutted under media conglomerate ownership. I think there are fewer and fewer media sources. I think there are more and more media sources owned by fewer and fewer mega corporations. And they often just sort of, if you watch the evening news, sometimes they seem to say that they have the script and they read from it. That's my experience. That's purely empirical. I have not researched that. But I will tell you this as an anecdote that I think you will find very interesting. After I published the book and before I reached out to you and before I reached out to UNC Asheville and other educational institutions here, I reached out to every local news outlet in the region about the book. Only one responded. And I bet you can guess which one it was. Maybe I'll tell you. It was the Mountain Express.
Oh,
And that is,
which I can't believe is still printing. I hate to say
I
that.
mean, I'm so
How have
happy.
they not been bought out by somebody?
I don't know. Someone has been smart. Because if you remember, it was a commentator in the Mountain Express that noticed the Azalea Road connection and
Right.
pulled it out. And so that silence tells me everything I need to know about our information ecosystem. There's no
I
other.
also feel like just to interrupt you for just a second, I'm sorry. From what I can recall, I feel like the Mountain Express is really the one that did so much more reporting on Zeb Quinn.
Correct.
He disappeared and
That's
was later.
They did, and they brought the connections about that case that no one else would investigate. So I
Right.
do think there's a serious apathy perhaps among investigators. Perhaps they're not given the resources. I don't know. But the news, there is definitely a dearth of interest. And yeah, and just to give you a couple of examples, the Jennifer Rose Gerard case from Biltmore Village, she was stabbed to death in her home in November of last year. And the man who was charged, who was found to have stabbed her, had been arrested 9 times before and was released 7 days before he killed her after a plea deal on assault charges. So, why was a man with that history on the street unmonitored? What went wrong? Where is that story? Why has no one written about that? Or you take the young girl, she was 14, Sundari Andrews Hopkin. I keep talking about her. She was missing from Arden in August of 2025, and her body was found in the woods near Long Shoals Road. Months later, there has been no follow-up. No cause of death has been released. There is no basic information about what we think or know happened to her. The authorities simply said there's no threat to the public, but they wouldn't say how a child died. And so, how can you reassure the public? Again, we get that conflicted message without telling them who killed the 14-year-old. How can we feel safe if you don't know what happened? So, I think that is another reason that I wrote it, because the local press should be digging into those questions, um, not ordinary people trying to fill a gap. So, again, I have to say there is a lack of concern and perhaps even an apathy about it. But
Right. And I remember when I was writing about Leslie Eugene Warren and his victims,
oh yeah,
he should not have been released from custody.
happened
And
there,
he
right?
was, and then he went to High Point and murdered another woman. I
Right.
think they had confiscated his car when he was under suspicion for Jamie Hurley's murder. He was just released. And then he went on to kill. I don't
Absolutely
understand that.
right.
You
He was
know
the
that,
baby face killer too, right?
yes. Yes.
He had that thing, that way of, right. That was, yeah, I have no idea how that happened.
He had a
It's
record of being in a juvenile detention facility, which I don't know. I'm assuming the police would have known that. They had to have. So there was something in his
right. He
back.
was very young when he started committing crimes, so he wasn't given hard time for
Right,
the initial crimes, I believe.
right.
And then by the time he wooed this girl, I mean, the things he said about her are horrifying. When you read the news, he was like, "I'll have her by tonight." And some of the things these men say, particularly the
Right.
Nancy Morgan case, that really shook me. I'll talk about that in a minute. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I can't answer why he was out, other than the juvenile justice system is prison light, for lack of a better term. And that does make sense for certain reasons. And perhaps Jamie was his first murder. I'd have to look at the record. I don't remember, but um, yeah, I don't know why. Am I wrong? Is that
I don't think she was.
so? But he hadn't been convicted of one
Right.
prior.
I
Okay,
think they later found out if I'm thinking of the right person, I think he had
I
committed a
think
murder
you're right.
in New York State, maybe.
And they just let him go.
They didn't know then that he had done
Oh,
it.
okay,
So
okay.
he
It was a
had some
lack of,
murders in his past
again,
that were unsolved.
it was a lack of investigative journalism.
And it was also cross state lines. So
Right.
he had gone across state lines. And all the pieces got tied together after he had murdered two or three other people.
Correct. The whole interstate piece is so interesting too. There's a former FBI agent, or CIA agent actually, who wrote a book about, was it, I can't remember. He wrote a book about how many current trucker serial killers are operating at any given time. And I think this book came out last year, and he said there were 450 of them. And I hate to say that, because there are so many good truckers, and without them, we don't have food, we don't have gas, we have nothing. And I really respect that vocation. But apparently, you mentioned, how he came from New York. They use the interstates as hunting grounds. These predators do, who a lot of whom happen to be truckers, and they have not been found or caught yet. That's the scary thing. And of course, they prey upon these vulnerable women who, um, have these poverty stories that just break your heart. But yeah, no, the Jamie Hurley and the Leslie Warren case, he was one of the eight serial killers who stalked this area. I couldn't believe there were that many. And he was one of them. And yeah, he was a nightmare. He's gone now, I believe.
No, he's still in prison.
He's still alive. God, I keep up with my own research. There's so much. No, you're right. He's still in prison. And so is Richard Jackson.
That's a whole nother issue too. The fact that they had to get Richard Jackson on a federal crime because his original confession was thrown
Right.
out was, I mean, they managed to get him, but
Yeah,
yeah,
sometimes the police don't help. For example, with the Karen Stiles case, there was an interview done with the perpetrator, and the way it was conducted would have allowed that confession to be thrown out, and it almost was.
I
So
think it was thrown out. I think that they couldn't use it, and that's why they had the federal government had to come in and charge him with a crime on federal land. Didn't respect, I think they didn't respect his Miranda rights, or they didn't read them to him, or maybe
they
he had
didn't. They
asked for an
did.
attorney and they went ahead
They
and
did
interrogated
something
something
wrong
like that.
in the Miranda area, and also he was the son of, or the adopted son of a very kind of well-known real estate magnate here, and perhaps there was a word put in. We don't know. We
Mhm.
can just speculate.
Well, I imagine he would have had the best representation regardless.
He did have a good lawyer.
I was
So
in college when that murder happened, so it was very scary to me because I was in college. I ran recreationally. Now, I did not go out to Bent Creek and run, but I remember when all that, the Citizen Times really latched on to that story, and I couldn't go anywhere in town without seeing the headlines because they did manage to catch him pretty fast, but
he did.
it
He
was
made
terrifying to me because I was almost the same age as Karen when she was murdered. And at that time, I also did not know that a murder had occurred on UNCA's campus in the
oh right.
70s.
That was horrifying
I
to the
was in my little bubble,
yeah.
and that was kind of a wake-up call that you can't just keep going places by your. I used to walk around downtown where Amber Lundgren was potentially abducted from by myself at night. And
Right.
after she, again, I think either I was in college or it was the year I graduated, I stopped doing that after
Good.
she was murdered. But
Good.
like you said, in Western North Carolina, in Asheville, you have this sense of safety and community that unless you do this work, you don't realize that there is a dark kind of a darkness to it. And you really have to go out of your way to protect yourself from it.
You
And
do.
that's, kind of one of my points of the podcast is that you just can't assume anything and you always have to be on alert, even if people think you're crazy. Because
Correct. No,
the research supports that.
research shows, I'm telling you, and anything that you can do on your podcast to help women identify these areas and these unsafe times and places that we're living in will be helpful too. Yeah, I the Karen Stiles case was so disturbing. I have a friend, she's a nurse, and she was hiking in on the Hard Times Trail recently. She was telling me about it as I was researching and doing this book. And she had this interesting story, which I'll tell you. She's a very spiritual kind of person, and she has how people say in Asheville that they have an animal totem. So she heard the bear was hers, and she was talking about how, because they're bears in the fall. She went walking alone on the Hard Times Trail this fall, but she brought her bear totem with her, and she actually saw a bear on the trail, but she had this energy that kind of, she's told me, warded it off, and she felt perfectly safe, and she just walked by. And that brings us back to the whole bear or man in the woods. Karen Stiles would have been better if she'd seen a bear instead of a man that day. And it just really highlighted for me how dangerous it would be to be in the woods with a strange man instead of a bear. I know it's a silly cultural thing that we talk about now, but there are reasons for that. She was safe with the bear, my friend herself, and Karen was not. And it's so sad.
That is true because a bear really is not a predator if you think about it. Most of the time that bears get violent is they're protecting like a baby cub or
Exactly.
going after food, which most of us aren't, carrying
Correct.
a huge
If
cooler full
I
of food through the woods.
and if I had one, I would just leave it. But
Yeah, take
you know,
what you want.
we should be careful with the bears. I'm not trying to suggest that we don't need to be,
Exactly.
but her
None of
story,
us want to confront a bear, mind you, but
we definitely don't. I've seen them in my yard. It can be, one's walked across my porch. I have it on the little ring camera. Like, what are you doing?
oh
But
yeah, looking for food.
there was just a murder in Lake Norman, wasn't there? I just read about something
Um,
happened there.
oh, there is an unsolved murder uh,
Mm.
from my town actually, because I'm in the suburbs of Charlotte. That it appeared it was a suicide at first, but I think the police determined that the victim fired the gun from her non-dominant hand.
Right.
So
That's
one of her romantic partners is a suspect.
right.
It
Right.
still has not been apprehended, and he collected her life insurance.
My God. See,
So, and
that
I'm sort of afraid to talk about it on this podcast
you
because he
shouldn't,
has
you
not
don't
been
have to, but
arrested.
that's why I'm calling the series The Unrecorded Dead, because they're, or murdered in that case, because we don't know. And I pointed out in my book, I'll just tell this for your listeners, that I found a pattern starting in the 2000s, especially the 2010s, of when a woman was murdered, it was, and a man was killed, it was murder suicide. So there's no investigation. There's no way to find out what happened. Why is that so prevalent? We don't know if a third person might have been there. These are just my thoughts because it seems statistically improbable that such a shift would happen from the 2000s to the 2010s, that suddenly everything's murder suicide. I know what you're talking about, slightly different, but
Mhm.
I just think it's an interesting pattern to look at. Could it be that when two people are dead, and it looks like it could be called a murder suicide, that we just call it that? I don't really know. I've often wondered if third people are involved in these cases simply because of the statistical improbability.
And you have to wonder how much does the police department dig into what was going on in their relationship? Were there any outside forces? There was a there was a couple I wrote about. It was last year sometime, I think, and they went missing from
Mhm.
Henderson County, I think, and they ended up being found dead in a hotel room in another state.
Oh,
But one of them was a doctor. So she was a doctor in Henderson County. Like she had a small practice, but not a small
right.
doctor, a
I
small
know what
practice.
you mean.
Yeah. And the police ended up saying that based on their investigation, it was a
Murder suicide.
double suicide, I think. Like, I think they both
Wow.
had a pact. Like, maybe it was a suicide pact, but they had to go into their financial records and go to their home, and they figured out they had left things arranged a certain way. And it was very disturbing for the community because they
And that
couldn't
didn't show up in my
understand
book
that.
because it didn't happen in this area. I couldn't bring those cases in or even research them. It would just be too unwieldy. But that's another interesting one.
Because you don't know, yeah, you don't know that it was violence against a woman. It sounded like it was an agreement between the husband and wife. They were also in their 50s, I think. There was something going on, but the police determined based on their research, they felt like that's what had happened. And I guess their adult children signed off on it and the case was closed.
Wow. Well, hopefully they did get it right. It
Yeah.
sounds like if the children knew about it, maybe they did. But that reminds me of a case, I think it was Haywood County in my book, where an elderly woman her husband had been taking care of her. She was near hospice stage, and he just ended her life and claimed that that was what she wanted. But we would never know. So there are questions. I have
Yeah.
questions.
You have
Um,
to take his word for it. And,
yeah,
is that what he wanted? Is that what she wanted? Did they agree on that together?
I don't think we have legalized euthanasia in this state at this point, especially unless it's in a hospital setting, which I'm not even sure we have that. I'd have to do some research into
Oh,
that.
I think it's illegal.
I think it's still illegal. So,
So
Yeah,
that
that's great.
that is a gray area if someone is tried and taken to court because legally it is a crime,
Right.
but you also don't know what the circumstances behind if someone was terminally ill and if they had an agreement, it's all that's very difficult too. But it's still considered violence against a woman
It
if you
is
based on your records.
still a femicide. So,
Yeah. Was there anything in your research that, well, you were probably surprised by a lot of things, but was there any one thing that kind of stuck out to you when you were researching this book
well,
that
like you, I was surprised by the sheer numbers and by the steep increase and the apathy about it. The fact that no one had documented, no one had looked at it and said, "What's going on?" I didn't expect to find that the rate had increased so much since the 1980s, and because there's no one was tracking it. No one, there was no headline anywhere saying femicide rate in Western North Carolina up 500%. Just silence. Um, and then I think that surprised me most of all. And then the failure of what we might call institutions. So men who had been in the system, been arrested, charged for assault on female, and then sometimes even convicted and then released to kill again. That's a failure of our sentencing system, possibly our bond system, which has changed a lot since 2020. That's a whole nother subject for a book. I think that the other thing that shocked me were, you know, the brutality of some of the cases shocked me. The fact that so many were unsolved, and I think there's still, you would probably know better than I, 19 women missing, whose bodies have never been recovered. We don't know what happened to them. And I think that what really tipped the whole thing off for me was sometimes, for example, the Nancy Morgan case, we have two murders actually, because the man who was involved in her murder, was it Johnson or Jackson? Am I getting his name wrong? Richard, the guy,
I think it was Johnson.
Johnson. Yeah, there's a Jackson and a Johnson. He, her case, the Nancy Morgan case, she was a domestic Peace Corps worker. And she came to Madison County from, I think it was Louisiana, to help people. But how she was viewed was, and this is a quote, she thought she was high and mighty. This woman who just came to help was regarded that way by this local man and his buddies. Um, she was, in 1970, she was kidnapped, gang raped over 2 nights, and taken to Tennessee and back to Madison County and strangled. And her body was left in a horrific position and dumped in Madison County at Tanyard Gap. And it went unsolved. And this we can attribute to the Ponder political machine, which is a whole nother story in and of itself. But in 2024, Richard Johnson confessed to a journalist. Finally, a journalist who's interested was Mark Pinsky. And what he said shocked me. His other words, "We all knowed her. She thought she was high and mighty." He was never charged. He's still never been charged despite that confession. But 14 years after Nancy's murder, he poisoned his own 5-year-old daughter with insecticide. And the book was written by his son. It's called How I Survived the Man Who Met Her on the Mountain. Because someone had written a book, The Man Who Met Her on the Mountain, talking about Nancy. But his son wrote the book. He knew his father had poisoned Joyce. He testified. She was only 5 years old. So the son testified. I've forgotten his name. His name is also Richard, and wrote a book about that. And I read his book in preparation for mine. It was very interesting. So if he had been caught for Nancy Morgan, he would never have been around to murder his own daughter. So the repeat offenders, the Eccleston case is another one, because he had his 3-month-old daughter died in 2016, and he was charged with involuntary manslaughter and child abuse, but the charges were dropped. This is Haywood County. And then he later went on to kidnap this woman and hold her captive for 4 months. So why didn't the system fully confront, what happened? And another one that bothers me a lot is the Lewis Kyle Wilson case. Well, the suspect, He is suspected as the Craven Street predator. We didn't talk about Craven Street, but that's a very well traveled next to downtown Asheville, in West Asheville. And he used to abuse prostitutes. He would brutalize them. And we think that he killed Kelly Lane Smith, whose remains were found in two locations near the river. But he was never charged, even though they found a toolkit of violence in his house. They found teeth, knives, saws, handcuffs, leg irons, hair, bags of hair. And we don't even know where he is now. We think he's living in Hawaii or something like that. So he was another one who was killed. These are the things that shocked me. And I think the final thing is, as I said, the number of serial killers. I had no idea there were eight, at least eight, that we know of.
Right.
Surely there have been more, and there may be some now. But I will say an interesting fact, despite the horrors of 2024 with femicides and 2025, in both years there were 10 that I counted. I haven't seen one since I published my book. So maybe just calling attention to it, putting that out there in the stratosphere.
So you've mentioned working on a second book.
Yes. Originally, I thought I will write 3 books about North Carolina. Western North Carolina, the Piedmont, which is Charlotte, Raleigh, Greensboro. Little did I know. And then the Eastern North Carolina. But when I started my second book, there are too many. It's shocking. Charlotte, okay, so I have to divide it into 3. So there's going to be the Western Piedmont, which I'm working on now, and it's finished. I'm just editing it. Then there's going to be the Eastern Piedmont, Raleigh, Orange County, Hillsborough, and the Sand Hill community. And then there'll be Southern Piedmont, which will be Charlotte and Gastonia and all those areas. Then after that, I'll do Eastern North Carolina. But I got the idea initially to do a national book. And I have a title that is pretty stirring. And I know that it will get a lot of interest. And I thought I should do that book second, but I just wanted to honor North Carolina first because I'm from here. The region I'm doing now is where the region I did first is where I live. The region I'm doing second is where my grandmother and mother were from. And then there will be the region where I grew up. I'll do Charlotte in that whole area, and then Eastern. I mean, I was an English major in college, and I wrote poetry, and I love creative writing. But this is just where I felt like I could use my expertise, and it worked.
Yeah.
One day I'll write fiction.
Great. I recommend everybody read it. It's very interesting. You will definitely learn some things that you did not know. I thought, I know all this stuff. No, I didn't.
Oh, I'm so glad that it was that way for you.
It really did. I learned a lot.
Because you know so much about this topic in this area.
Unfortunately, yes, I do. But I think people will find it interesting that the niche angle of it is very important, I think. And like you said, it's very relevant in today's society. We aren't talking about this enough, that violence against women is making a comeback, unfortunately. And we need to figure out why. And the other thing, I'm going to say this before we end our discussion. As we were sitting here talking, I was thinking, I wonder if the rise of social media has contributed to some of this violence. Because you mentioned the groups of people that are kind of being, fed propaganda, indoctrinated about how men are being oppressed and that they need to take ownership of women. So there's that. But then you also have social media where people are reconnecting with people are having extramarital affairs.
True.
People they connect on social media. I'm imagining the social media becomes a conflict in partners, in households.
Yes.
Then you've just got so many different things fed into your algorithm to make you angry.
Exactly. Yes. I think that's a very good point. And I do think it is fomenting a lot of this violence.
Yes.
If say a man or a woman has a phone and their spouse is nearby and they're hiding it, something's going on. And they say that when men are challenged about their women, that is, I mean, it's harder for men to not have work. That also is very difficult for a man to not have a vocation. When they're challenged about their woman, quote unquote, or their women, that just destroys them. But it's what they do when that happens that we have to
how they handle it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, why can they not handle the problems without violence? What happened to make them think that they're entitled to do this? And why are women being murdered at such an exponential rate? Why are we not looking at this? This is a huge problem. No woman should be hurt. No woman should be destroyed and or mistreated or treated like she has no value. And whenever this is happening, you're going to stand up, and I'm going to stand up for these women too. I know that. And we're going to continue to do that until we have uncovered all the reasons so something can change.
Yes. Well, this was a great discussion. I'm so glad you came on the show. Thank you for taking time, and we survived the ice storm.
We did survive
of 2026.
2026. Well, it was lovely to meet you.
Yes.
I so appreciate you giving me a chance to do this. This is the first time I've ever been on a podcast. So important. All right. Well, Renee, it was lovely to meet you. Thank you so much. And I look forward to hearing the podcast come out.
This brings us to the conclusion of this episode of Missing in the Carolinas. Helen St. Clair's book, The Killing Trails, is the first in a series titled The Unrecorded Dead. She is currently completing her second book, The Milltown Murders, Homicides in the Western Piedmont of North Carolina, 1771 to 2025, with future volumes planned for the Triangle, the Southern Piedmont, and Eastern North Carolina, as well as a later project examining these patterns nationally. If you enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and give it a 5-star rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, so please like our pages and get started on a discussion of the missing people and true crimes profiled on the show. Do you know of a missing persons case in North or South Carolina that you think should be covered? Email me at missinginthecarolinas@gmail.com with any details you can share. Cover art for this podcast was designed by Macintosh Multimedia. All episodes are researched and written by me, Renee Robertson, with sound editing provided by Daniel Robertson. Thanks so much for listening.